Welcome to another episode of On the Way Home. I am your host, Michael Braithwaite from Blue Door. As always, we have an amazing guest here for you today. But before we get to the guest, I want to talk to you a little bit about my organization, Blue Door. I have the great privilege of working with some amazing heroes there who work on the front lines to provide emergency housing, transitional housing, really cool employment programs that pay a living wage, like our Construct program that launches people into construction, and also people who are going to go into construction and build the 3 million homes that we need across the country to end homelessness. And then all sorts of support services we wrap around individuals in the communities. We work with seniors, we work with families, we work with youth, we work with women fleeing violence. It's really, really cool. I work with heroes, as I said. They do great work. And as we're speaking, we are in the process of opening up a New York region built and owned by the region transitional housing unit, 18 new units, 1-bedroom units for men, much needed in our region. So it is very, very cool. Take off my glasses. They're fogging up. Hopefully I can still see. And we, of course, partner on this podcast with the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. I'm sure you've heard of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. They are going to, as of November 1st, and we'll be talking to one of the presenters today, they are running the largest conference in North America for the first time in person for obvious reasons in a couple of years, but it's virtual too if you can't travel or not comfortable traveling. That is in Toronto, November 1st, I think, to the 4th. It's going to be very, very exciting. They have all sorts of amazing speakers coming out. So if you're in the sector or interested in this sector, there's still time to register and come out for that. They're doing great work. They, of course, run all sorts of training, all sorts of different kinds of trainings at the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. So go to caeh.ca. You can check out their Built for Zero work that they do in different communities and much, much more. Check them out. They're doing cool work, and we'll see them all at the conference. Now, let's get to today's speaker. We have a great speaker. I'm really interested in this because I grew up during this time, and I remember this quite well, the conversation we're going to have today. And it was in Toronto in the 90s. Today, I have Sam Blondeau. And so Sam graduated from Trent University with a joint BA in Sociology and Child and Youth Studies with a specialization in Criminology and Socio-Legal Studies. They are currently an MA Criminology student at Ontario Tech University, and their research interests are homelessness policy and life course effects of the criminalization of homelessness. Super cool, and we're going to talk about that today. Sam, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Michael. Happy to be here. I'm excited to talk about Squeegee Kids.
Well, as am I, and I remember that I haven't heard that term in a long time. Before we get to that, I want to cover a couple things. We ask everyone the same question when they come on the show because everyone's answer is a little different because it's personal. What does home mean to you?
Well, see, that's a pretty complicated question. It's not a simple question at all. Funny enough, that was a assignment I had in my sociology of homelessness class that I took in undergrad, where we had to do a photo essay on what home meant to us. And I think the best way I can describe it is that home is a feeling, right? Home is about feeling safe and warm and taken care of. So home can come with you everywhere. It doesn't have to be a physical structure. It is the people you are around. It is the people you take care of and the people that take care of you. So that's my answer.
I love that. You know, it's quite often, Sam, to what you were just talking about, quite often, and you probably get asked this as well, people will say, so what does homelessness look like? And I use that answer. I say, it's not really a look. So look in the mirror, look around you. There isn't one look to people experiencing homelessness. However, it is a feeling, and that feeling of loneliness, isolation, fear, etc. Right? So that feeling you talk about, that is great, and not one we've heard so far, right? We have different definitions of homelessness, so we've seen that because it's a little different for different people. We have an Indigenous version that kind of is more around the elements and nature and family and that kind of thing, and then you have your traditional homeless hub definition as well. I love what you were talking about with the feeling, Sam. In your bio, that you sent me, you talk about how your work is informed by your own lived experience and as well your work on the front lines as a social worker. Can you expand on this a little bit for our listeners?
Yeah, so I came to university by way of a different path than most people do. In the 90s, I was a street involved youth. And when that was going on, I developed a lot of really amazing, important connections with my friends, because when I was a street involved youth in the 90s, the landscape of homelessness was much different than now, right? We didn't have the youth shelter. There was no youth shelters. There were no services for us. Homeless youth wasn't even a category, right? Like the terminology was runaways and throwaways at that point, because the reason you were on the street was either you were running away from bad stuff or you came from bad stuff and they kicked you out. So because that was my experience, and I was one of the, I quote unquote say lucky ones, because I had some semblance of a support system, I was able to go to college, and I really wanted to make use of what I went through. And I really wanted to work on the front lines with at-risk youth in Peterborough. So that's what my whole aim was with my social service worker diploma. And then I worked frontline for 12 years, and I got to do a lot of really cool stuff. I worked with foster kids, I worked in group homes, and I worked in almost every shelter in Peterborough. I got to work at the youth emergency shelter, which was amazing for me because, like I said, that didn't exist for us. And the Peterborough Youth Emergency Shelter was actually kind of born because of what was happening with us. The social workers that were getting involved in creating that were social workers that were in schools with us and talking to us in these little groups, and recognized there was no supports for us anywhere. So working at the youth shelter was amazing. I moved on to warming room and stuff, and then I worked for Canadian Mental Health Association for a while. And I ended up working with the homelessnness partnering strategy. We were the first pilot program here in Peterborough. So I was a community outreach worker, and we got to create the program from the bottom up. So our mandate was to work with the hardest to serve in Peterborough in whichever way that meant. So our biggest mandate was to try to help people find housing, but more importantly, try to keep it. So that meant we got to do a lot of really cool creative stuff. And we got to do really cool programs. Like we had an ODSP project where we helped people transition from Ontario Works to ODSP. We had an ID bank. I ran ID clinics. And all of these ideas and the way that I did stuff when I was working frontline, I was coming at from like my own experience or from listening to people that I had worked with. And then when I came back to university, it's funny because I was actually homeless again, and I couldn't, it was a housing crisis. I came back to Peterborough with my kid, and I could have been my own client. I would have qualified for the project that I created. So I was living with my parents, and I went back to university, and it was in university that I realized I was never a social worker. I was always a sociologist. It was always more about social theory and systems for me than it was about like the interpersonal stuff. So that's when I decided to switch gears and try to come at it from a policy lens of things, try to see if there's something I can do to inform the bigger picture, to maybe, I don't know, shape roles a little differently for people that are doing the work that I used to do. Because I see people doing the work that I used to do, and the systems have gotten worse. I couldn't even do what I wanted to do then, and people can do even less now. Somehow the situation has gotten exponentially worse over the last like 10 years. It's unreal.
Yeah, agreed. What a journey. And thanks so much for sharing that. Very, very cool. I mean, I think that gives you such a unique perspective in the work that you do. So we're going to dial it back to the 90s. I remember them quite well. And I remember the term, so I was in Niagara, but we'd hear terms coming out of Toronto. We heard all about the Squeegee Kid, the legendary Squeegee Kids. It was used quite often and even more prominent, and we'll talk more about that and the kind of battles and how it was demonized in the media or by politicians. But for those who may be too young or maybe not familiar, could you talk a little bit about what the term meant and who were Squeegee Kids?
So, I mean, essentially, Squeegee Kids were vulnerable kids, right? Squeegee Kids were street involved youth who decided that they wanted to try to earn a living somehow. They wanted to try to earn some money instead of sitting on the corner panhandling and flying a sign and begging. So what they did was they got squeegees and buckets, and they went to intersections with lights, and they offered to wash windshields for people for spare change. So they were essentially entrepreneurs, but the problem is they were entrepreneurs outside of the larger capitalist sort of engagement, which got people a little mad.
A little bit, yes. So let's talk about this. The government saw it in a negative light, and in fact, waged a war on Squeegee Kids with coming in with the Ontario Safe Streets Act in 2000. Can you talk about how this came about and what the result was due to this action?
Yeah, that headline of War on Squeegee Kids, like I remember when that headline was like when it came out. Like I remember seeing that on the papers back in the day. And every time I think about that headline, and it's come up in my research more than once, like it still makes me cringe. Because when I read that, all I can think about is the headline is a war on kids. It was literally a war on vulnerable kids who were just trying to survive, and they were just trying to find a way to find some meaning in what they were doing, rather than just sitting on a corner and begging for money. I mean, and also keep in mind that like the systems at the time, the supports available to kids were not what they are now, right? So what happened is that at the beginning, when Squeegee Kids first popped up in like 95, there was a really positive narrative that, and most people thought about it the way I just said, that people were providing a service instead of just sitting on the corner begging for change, right? But then around 96, 97 is when things started to take a turn. And that's when there started to be these headlines coming out where they were describing Squeegee Kids as locusts and harbingers of danger and you know signs of civil disorder and disobedience. And they used the narrative that Squeegee Kids were dangerous and violent. They picked a couple of different stories where there was people saying that Squeegee Kids were forcefully trying to like wash their windshields. A politician said that he had a windshield broken. But what's really interesting is that when you talk to the Squeegee Kids were far more victimized than any of the motorists were. Like Squeegee Kids just get assaulted on the regular. They would be verbally assaulted, physically assaulted, degraded, have things thrown at them. But that wasn't a conversation that was happening, right? No one was worried about what was happening to these kids. Everyone was worried about what these kids were doing to our civil society. So they waged a campaign because Mel Lastman, the mayor at the time, wanted some actual like legal ramifications to try to criminalize squeegeeing. And so they ended up being able to pass the Ontario Safe Streets Act, royal assent on January 30th, 2000, which essentially criminalized squeegeeing without saying squeegeeing in the act. So with the Ontario Safe Streets Act, what it is it's criminalized the solicitation on a roadway or providing services on a roadway or or doing solicitation in like a confined space, so like at ATMs or in doorways. And then as an added little punch, it also adds in there that you can't get rid of used condoms, broken glass, or needles, because that was another part of the narrative that was being used against Squeegee Kids, was that they were a bunch of just drug addicts and that they were dangerous. So what's happened is the Ontario Safe Streets Act ended an almost 30-year era of the decriminalization of homelessness in Canada. Because in 1972 is when the Vagrancy Act was taken out of the Canadian Criminal Code. And then in 2000 is when the Ontario Safe Streets Act was born, which is our first our first provincial neo-vagrancy law. And then in turn, we have it all across Canada now in different capacities. What's super interesting, though, is that the Ontario Safe Streets Act, when it first passed, actually criminalized charities too, right? Because you weren't supposed to stand on a roadway and collect money. So when the police are out there, or March of Dimes or whatever, in these parking lots with buckets collecting change, that was technically criminalized under the Ontario Safe Streets Act. So what they did was in 2004, they amended it so that only charities can do that, which is so ironic because a lot of these charities provide services, right? So the charity that provides a service for the vulnerable youth can panhandle, but the vulnerable youth who needs money to buy food that day isn't allowed to.
Yeah, yeah. It's thank you so much. A large reason why we do this podcast is education, and thank you so much for that education right there. I didn't know that, and to see it's just basically under a different name they brought the Vagrancy Act back in. And I remember a few years back reading in the paper, not Squeegee Kids, but there's one gentleman experiencing homelessness that has $65,000 in fines, and they threw them out, right? But what a waste of time! And that poor guy, like I mean, all those Squeegee Kids that are fined when you criminalize it, you're setting them back years of finding housing because now they have records or unpaid fines. Their finances it's so much harder to get ahead when they throw those fines on, right? So you're right. They missed out on the point of, hey, why don't we look at the root cause of why someone would have to do that instead of attacking the people doing it, right? For sure.
We just reverted back to the old school criminalization processes, right? And because it was over poverty in our faces, and society doesn't deal well with that, because when it's in your face, then you have to deal with it, right? So, and interestingly enough, Squeegee Kids don't exist anymore, but the Ontario Safe Streets Act still does, and has had was like in the Can I See Your ID study, it was I think $3 billion or something in Ontario Safe Streets Act fines in just a short period of time, like a 7-year period or something. Like it's unreal.
So you've done a lot of work around this. You've recently just done a study, and at the upcoming CAH conference in November, you'll be leading a session called Squeegee Punks Reunite, Safe Streets for All. Can you share with us what this session will cover?
Well, what I want to do is I want to cover the importance of lived experience perspectives when it comes to things like legislation or services that are being provided, or any of these discussions around policies or programs that really impact people's lives. And talk about some of the alternatives to criminalization that could have been used or are being experimented in other places now that could have been used then, as well as trying to have a conversation around what frameworks work to help engage people when they are in the living experience part of it. How do we safely help people who are living through it get their voices heard so they're not re-victimizing themselves or re-traumatizing themselves or being tokenized?
I love it. I love it. We often say on this show too is nothing for us without us. Why would you not have those voices included? They're the most important ones. Now, you've done a study just recently or a while back around Squeegee Kids and that phenomenon. Like how did that study all come together, and what were your hopes that you would discover throughout it?
Well, it's funny because the study actually started a couple of years ago. Like the whole idea about it started a couple of years ago in my second year undergrad. Like up until I was getting ready to write a paper for an equality class, I had no clue that Squeegee Kids were even in the literature. Like I didn't know. I had no clue. So I stumbled across an article that had Squeegee Kids in the title, and I was like, "Are you kidding me? Squeegee Kids? Like there's articles? What are you? Huh? What?" And so I read it, and I was just dumbfounded and mind blown. And so I went down a rabbit hole. I was like, "Oh my God." There's all of this stuff where they talked, like there was like a huge dearth of research done in this small window of time when the Ontario Safe Streets Act was happening, right? So I got really into it, and it became very personal to me because I was reading about my own experiences and my friends, and then I started to really notice a disconnect between what I was reading in the literature and what I knew to be true, right? Like, and noticing that the literature really is all coming from like researchers' perspectives and people without lived experience, which makes sense for the time. But what I wanted to do was I wanted to try to do an updated conversation. So because the Ontario Safe Streets Act is still in play and it's still doing so much damage everywhere and it's still so many consequences, I wanted to try to have a conversation and add to the conversation about what's happened now. Where are Squeegee Kids now? Like, what did the Ontario Safe Streets Act, how did that affect the rest of their lives? Like how did being the target of a war when you're on the street from the politicians that are supposed to be taking care of you, like, did that do anything the rest of your life? Where are you at now? Like, what would you have to say about the way the Ontario Safe Streets Act happened, about the campaign, or about, what could have been done differently? And it's also super interesting because most of my friends back in the day were very activist minded. We were very politically minded and activist minded back then. So it seems extra strange that no one tried to engage to come up with other ideas, right? Because we would have been a group of people where it probably would have had more fruition come to it than they realized. But it was really more about me wanting to add an authentic layer to this conversation that's been going on for a while in the literature that most of my friends weren't even aware was going on. So if I get lucky, it will help inform some sort of process that will repeal it. It's been challenged numerous times for charter rights. There's been different campaigns to try to repeal it. So I'm hopeful that maybe some of the stuff that comes out of my study will help inform that in the end. That would be amazing.
Very cool. And no doubt that it will. Have there been any surprises along the way of the study, things that you didn't anticipate?
No, honestly, the biggest surprise is the fact that I can do the study. Like, that's what I didn't anticipate. I did not, I didn't think people would care. Like, honestly, like, I didn't think that it would be as well received as it's been. And because it's from 20 years ago, right? And because it's like in the past and it's something that's just taken for granted as the way things are now, how interested people are in what I'm doing is actually the biggest surprise. So
very cool. Well, I'm not surprised. It's such, like I said, it was a big thing back, and it'd be amazing to hear more the stories of how that criminalization actually affected so many people.
Mhm.
So what happens when you said, here's my hope. So when do you hope to finish the study? And what do you want to do? Like, once you have that, are you going to roll with something else? Or are you going to take that push forward? What do you hope to do?
Well, when I'm not sure when I'm going to be able to finish the study. Hopefully, in a couple of months. All fingers crossed. But what I want to do, one of the knowledge mobilization things I want to do is I want to create a zine. So I would like to create like a zine where each of the people I talk to, depending on how many people, will have a page and kind of about like the one takeaway or the one thing they want people to know about what it was like to be a squeegee kid, right? Like to create some sort of cool knowledge mobilization that might get people talking is the one goal that way. And then what I'm hoping to do is go on to do my PhD. And the research I want to do for my PhD really ties into this, just with a different group of people. So I want to take a look at criminalization in Peterborough, and I want to do a similar sort of idea where I talk with people with lived experience, and we try to come up with a social innovation model, some way to engage the stakeholders and people in power in Peterborough to try to bring the voice of lived experience to policy decisions here, because we've got some serious issues happening, and I think we need all hands on deck. So,
Very cool. What about a documentary? So I think this would, like, people would be fascinated if you're sitting down where they're telling their stories, and I don't know. I mean, you've seen the response so far. I'm just thinking, could that be a next step? Is to do something like
well,
that?
maybe. I mean, it's all about funding. You see, if you've got lines and grants that I can secure that aren't too much for me to write, then maybe we can do that. But you know what? Now, there is actually a documentary out there. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's called Spit,
No.
Street Punks in Traffic. And it was filmed in the 90s. It was filmed right when the Ontario Safe Streets Act stuff was going on. And it's the lens from a squeegee kid. It's Roach and a director. You should really check it out. It is such a good it's such a good representation of what was going on, because it's nitty gritty, and it's like the Roach cam, and he's out there and he's recording stuff. And then he actually got another grant and did a second one where it's him traveling across Canada, and some of that is him in legislature calling Harris out about the Ontario Safe Streets Act and stuff.
Yeah. Geez, that, we have not recovered from so many things during that period of time. I always talk about 1995 when they reduced social assistance rates by 21%, and we feel like they've never recovered. They're still below 1995 levels, yet we're living at 2022 prices, right? Which is crazy.
With the housing crisis that is affecting people of all walks of life now, not just the people that have been dealing with housing precarity forever, right? Yeah, it's definitely getting to be a much more complex landscape out there.
Well, I was at something recently where a counselor said in 2010 they couldn't get anyone to write a line in the media about housing or housing crisis or homelessness. But now that it's affecting the middle class and not just our most vulnerable, it is on everyone's mind. Which, double-edged sword. Should it have been a long time ago? Yes. But hey, we'll take it. And if it takes that kind of pressure to get different policy, we've said here, the crisis in the 90s, that's when it really began, when the federal government got out of building social housing, hundreds of thousands of units a year. It's a result of bad policy. The only thing that's going to change it is good policy. And you're working on that. You're making sure that the voices of lived experts or lived experience are going to be involved in those policy changes. So cool. So awesome. If someone wanted to check out some of the work you're doing, do you do social media? Where could people find out more or follow?
So there's the YouTube, there's that video from I have a presentation I did in undergrad, which was the first Squeegee Kid paper that people can look at on YouTube. But other than that, I don't really have anything out there other than the other project I'm working on, which ties into it with Dr. Naomi Nichols and her Research for Social Change Lab here in Peterborough. And so that's the Research for Social Change Lab at Trent. And people can check out the zines that we're working on there. And we're looking at the shelter justice, like we're looking at the shelter system in Peterborough and mapping things out. So it all really ties in. And our next zine is actually going to be all lived experience perspectives. So, and that zine's online as well.
Very cool. I encourage people to check that out. I encourage people to go to your session at the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. They will not be disappointed, as we were not today. Seb, thank you so much for all the work you did on the front lines and now in helping to create good policy and make sure that the voices of our most vulnerable are heard. It's been so wonderful chatting with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael. It was nice to be here.
We'll see you at the conference. Well, listen, like every time, so this is our second conference guest. We had Abe on, and then we have Sam. I am so pumped for this conference because I would say brilliant people doing great work. Here we have someone who is a lived expert, a voice of lived experience, who then, through the eyes of their frontline work, just really effective, and then went back to school, said, hey, you know what? I'm going to do this on a policy level. So cool. I wish that would happen even more often. Squeegee Kids was a phenomenon back in the 90s, and so cool to hear of this work happening now. Listen, criminalization of our most vulnerable never works. We've seen that with encampments, and it just doesn't work, right? It's not the way to go. And I'm sure that every survey that does work around that will show you just that. Another great episode. We'll see you next time on the way home.